I don't know about you, but I think one of the hardest things to being a parent is receiving feedback or maybe even critique or criticism from other parents, or maybe even just my own parents. There's something about that feedback that is just really hard for me to swallow. I don't know if it's like that for you, but today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in our daily segment, Facing the Dark, we're going to talk about how we receive critique or criticism, and how, as parents, when we receive it, is there a way that we can kind of receive it that teaches our own kids how to receive correction and instruction in a way that honors the Lord? Dr. Kathy has some insights on this, so let's hear what Dr. Kathy has to say on this topic.
Don't be afraid of the dark, be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So Dr. Kathy, in a recent article at Smart Brief, Candace Chilou wrote, "Why Complaints Demand a Caring Response." This article highlights how to receive feedback or critique, and then how to have kind of a level head in responding. I've always wondered about this with parenting. Sometimes we kind of get cutting feedback, sometimes from our spouse or from family members or even from our kids. And I'd like to hear you kind of speak to this. How should we kind of value that and kind of receiving that? Is there value in receiving critique and criticism sometimes in our parenting? And how should we receive it from that party without it kind of teaching that party that maybe cutting feedback or critique isn't something that they should just kind of offer, maybe without being given that space? I don't know. I kind of wrestle with this. What are your thoughts here?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. I've been teaching since before I founded my ministry the art of complimenting and correcting. So I'm going to go on record to say that criticism has no place. A negative critique must offer hope. It doesn't do you, your spouse, your children, a coworker, your own parent, and it doesn't do them any good to be told what is wrong. What does some good is what is wrong, and therefore try it this way next time. And so a cutting critique, cutting feedback, to use, her phrase in her article, I just think doesn't have a place. I think that's a power play. I think that's a mean-spirited person who's trying to put people down and put them in their place. So let's remember that what we define it, and you can look it up in a dictionary, the word correct is to put it right, and the word criticism is to point it out. So if I simply point out something that a spouse, coworker, or a child is doing wrong, I've been critical, and none of us want to have a critical spirit. Think about the people that you respect. I guarantee you, they're not critical people. Criticism rips at your hide. It destroys the heart. It causes you to disrespect, because criticism is simply pointing it out. Correction is putting it right. So if somebody does critique you in a negative way, if somebody does have cutting feedback, like, that was really foolish, or I can't believe you did it that way, or you're late again. They're just saying things that are, very critical. I think we ask for details. We, so support me, help me, teach me what I can do differently next time. And I'm going to say something else, and y'all can take it or leave it. What I've taught parents for years is that if you have something that concerns you about a child, you keep your mouth shut until you can offer them hope they can change. If you see your child is disrespectful, your child is impatient, your child is rushing, your child is lazy, your child is not proofreading, your child is doing something that concerns you, it doesn't do them any good for you to point it out. What does them good is to be taught, not told, taught how to change. So you listen longer, you observe longer with your eyes, and you figure out, hey, try it this way next time, and I think you'll have so much more success.
I really love that. I think that's so important for us as adults and parents to kind of hear ourselves too, that maybe when we receive a critique or a criticism or what have you, that it could be kind of maybe we receive it with that heart or with that attitude. Sometimes I wonder if how we respond to those things also teaches our kids how they should respond, because not everyone that they're going to interact with is going to have that kind of attitude, right? I mean, my son had an incident at work this past week where it didn't go according to that fashion, but it was interesting talking to him about how he received it. And then did he correct his behavior, or did he hold it against that person? And what was kind of the ultimate goal there? And I think within all of this, it kind of comes down to this challenge of correction sometimes feels like an affront on our identity. And we kind of maybe feel like this is how I'm presenting myself, and now you're correcting it. And so now I feel offended because I feel like you're not trying to correct a behavior, you're actually trying to correct me as a person. Maybe you could kind of give some insight into this. How can we kind of guide our kids and those that around us that we love to have a stronger sense of their identity so that when they do receive critique on maybe a behavior or a habit or something, that it's not necessarily attacking their identity? What is it about identity that we need to maybe galvanize here so that our kids and maybe even ourselves, that we can be corrected?
It's such an interesting point because we teach identity causes behavior. It is who we say we are. And I can understand why, if that part of us is criticized or even corrected, it would be a more dangerous place for us to be. So, do we respect the person? Is it possible the person is right? I appreciate that your son maybe didn't immediately reject out of hand the feedback, even though it was done in a negative, critical way. Is there anything right in what I've just been told? In that 10-minute interaction that he observed, was I critical? Was I disrespectful? Like, I might not consider myself disrespectful in general, but is it possible that what he observed appeared to be disrespect because of a tone of voice or body language or the fact that I stayed in the corner, didn't walk toward the person, whatever? Is there anything true there? And that takes real humility, right? So maybe we talk with our children and adults we love about humility and wanting to improve. Like, I imagine, Wayne, that you want all of your children to have a heart for growth. You want them to recognize that they've done better, they are becoming more mature, but shouldn't all of us want to keep growing up? None of us have arrived yet. So do we want to improve? I think that changes our attitude when we hear people critique us.
Yeah, I really think that's so true. And for me, it's kind of a thing that really touches into the sense of kind of living an honoring life, a life that's honoring God. In fact, I would say that kind of like being able to be corrected is also being able to fall underneath the authority of Christ. And there's something for me, I've talked to my kids a lot about this, of what it means to kind of be in the church, that the church isn't just an activity that we do. It's actually something that we kind of belong to. And when you become kind of a member of a church, which I think is kind of a big deal, that you should be a member of a church, that there is also then that opportunity for the church to kind of step in and say, hey, you might be out of line and you might need to kind of bring some of your habits or your kind of thinking or your different possibilities that are going on there underneath the authority of God. And so that the church ends up being kind of a really important place, I think, for kids. And I think they start to learn some of those rhythms naturally, maybe in school. But I'd like to hear you maybe kind of talk about that kind of dynamic of this, how critique and correction not only is important for us to build and correct maybe some identity practices, but maybe it's also kind of this lifelong endeavor of being a disciple of Jesus. What kind of conversations do you think we should be having to kind of model this for our kids so that they can kind of have that attitude of, I'm falling underneath the leadership and the authority of Christ, and he's put people in my life to do this?
Bingo. Yeah, I love that. Again, do they want to grow? Do they want to mature? Do they have goals? Do they have a standard? Do they know the difference between good, better, and best? Do they have someone to model their character, ability, and stewardship upon? I hope it's Jesus. I hope that we are talking more about Christ and showing them where they still fall short, not because they're bad people, but because they're young and they haven't studied enough yet the attributes of Christ, perhaps, and maybe the role of sacrifice or the role of perseverance or the role of, again, humility. Christ was so humble. So yeah, and what you said about the church is really interesting, because in the perfect world, the church would be authority and they would discipline appropriately. And far too many churches don't take seriously what the scripture teaches about, a brother going to a brother, and if not, they don't listen, then you bring in, a spiritual leader. And, there ought to be a time of separation when there's been sin in the camp and there's a separation. And so often we don't do that. So that's not being modeled well. Now, if you're listening and you have a church that does that well, boy, praise the Lord. Yeah, it's got to be done well, right? It's got to be done very carefully. There's more I could say, but I better leave it at that. Fascinating discussion.
I'd love to hear the different Bible verses or passages or stories that are going through your mind as Dr. Kathy and I visited on this topic today. The one that's probably running through most of your minds comes out of Proverbs 27. It's one that was running through my mind. And this is what the writer of Proverbs says. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. For me, when I kind of take a step back and understand the role and the purpose of Proverbs, especially in the biblical canon, and then understanding that some of these verses are really hard, like it really tests my spirit and my heart to, like I kind of mentioned in the podcast, to actually find myself living under the authority of God and under the authority of God's people. And I think as we lead our kids well in these moments, especially in moments of critique, that doing it with a heart and an attitude of falling underneath God's authority and seeking wisdom and counsel and insight from his people, man, I just think that doing that can be a bright light that shines and cuts through incredible darkness that we might not even recognize that we're in. And we hope that this podcast, specifically this episode, has been an encouragement for you. You know, Dr. Kathy has talked about wanting to get just some feedback on different things that we're doing here at Celebrate Kids. And one of those things that we're doing here at Celebrate Kids is launching a new Saturday program on this podcast channel that provides greater in-depth teaching from Dr. Kathy. Specifically, we're going to be looking at some back-to-school topics on this podcast. And we'd love to hear from you. What would you benefit hearing Dr. Kathy speak on as we get prepared to have our young people go back to school? So if you have any topics or ideas or questions, or maybe even comments on this podcast, please email me personally so that I can bring those into the show and also pass them along to Dr. Kathy. You can email me at Wayne, that's WAYNE, at ignitethefamily.com. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook and the rest of us here at the Celebrate Kids podcast, and the rest of us here at Celebrate Kids and Ignite the Family, I want to say thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.